In a mansion of silence and secrets, one woman's instinct turns an ordinary day into a fight for life. Stay with us until the end. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Langford estate sat on the edge of the Connecticut coastline, a sprawling monument to old money and modern influence. Its long driveway curved past manicured gardens, through iron gates polished to a shine, and ended in front of a white-columned entrance that could have belonged to a historic government building. Inside, the ceilings stretched impossibly high, each wall adorned with oil paintings in heavy gold frames. Thick Persian rugs softened every step, muffling sound until the whole house seemed to hum with a controlled, deliberate quiet. In the largest suite, tucked away behind double mahogany doors, Edward Langford lived out his recovery. At 74, he was a man who had once commanded entire boardrooms with nothing more than a steady gaze and a clipped sentence. A billionaire investor, philanthropist, and master negotiator, his name had been printed in headlines for decades. Now, after a complex heart surgery, he was reduced to a pale figure in a wheelchair, wrapped in a robe and rarely leaving his private rooms. Doctors declared the procedure a success. The official story was that he was getting stronger each day, but to anyone who looked closely, there were cracks in that narrative. Grace Williams moved through the estate like a shadow. She was 28, a black woman with calm, thoughtful eyes, and a stillness that seemed to steady any room she entered. Hired just a few months before Edward's surgery, she had quickly adapted to the rhythm of the house. The unspoken rules of service, the invisible lines between staff and family, the way silence could be as important as speech. Her crisp black and white uniform was always immaculate, her dark hair neatly pulled back, her shoes shining. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when she did, her words were measured and deliberate. Grace had grown up far from this world of sprawling gardens and crystal chandeliers. Her experience came from working in smaller homes, caring for elderly clients, and years earlier, nursing her younger brother through a long recovery after surgery. That was when she learned to notice the subtle signs others missed. A change in skin tone, the way someone shifted in their chair, the tiny tremor in a hand that didn't used to be there. Edward's staff seemed content to follow the doctor's assurances. The live-in nurse reported progress. The butler repeated to guests that Mr. Langford was regaining strength. But Grace saw something different. When Edward lifted his teacup, his left hand shook almost imperceptibly. When he wheeled himself up the slight incline toward the window, his breath caught for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression. These were details no one asked her about, and so she kept them to herself until the morning. She noticed something she couldn't ignore. She had been polishing the brass lamp on the table beside his bed when Edward leaned forward in his wheelchair to adjust his robe. The thick brown collar fell slightly open, revealing a patch of fabric pressed against his chest. It took her a moment to register that the faint, uneven stain on the robe wasn't tea or coffee. The color was darker, deeper, blood. Not bright red, but old enough to be thick, seeping slowly through in a steady bloom. "Sir," she said softly, careful not to alarm him, "you're bleeding." Edward glanced down briefly, frowned as though she'd pointed out a spot of lint, and then waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing, Grace. Just the stitches healing. The doctor said it's normal." Her eyes stayed fixed on the spreading mark. She'd seen surgical wounds before, and she remembered the way her brother's surgeon had spoken to the family, explaining what to watch for, what meant danger. That dark shade wasn't right, but Edward had already turned his wheelchair toward the tall windows, letting the matter drop. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Grace stared at the ceiling. Usually the quiet of the estate lulled her to sleep, but tonight it felt heavy, pressing against her ears. She replayed the scene again and again. The faint slump in his shoulders, the paleness in his skin, the slight shiver in his hands. She told herself it wasn't her place. There were trained professionals here, people with degrees on their walls, yet another voice in her mind countered sharply, if they were doing their jobs, why had no one else noticed? By morning, she had made a decision. When she brought Edward's breakfast tray into his suite, he was sitting by the fireplace, the robe draped loosely around him, eyes distant as if watching something far beyond the flames. Grace set the tray on the small table beside him, but her gaze went immediately to his chest. The stain was larger, darker, as though it had been feeding on the hours that had passed. She stood still for a moment, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She knew speaking up again could be a mistake, could even cost her this job, but the thought of staying silent was worse. "Sir," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I think we need to have that wound checked again." Edward didn't look at her. "Grace, I told you." "With respect," she said, cutting in a breach of etiquette that sent a rush of heat through her. "I think it's worse than you think." That made him pause. Slowly, he turned his head toward her. No one interrupted Edward Langford. She braced herself for the sharp rebuke, but instead of anger, she saw fatigue settle across his features. "It's nothing," he repeated, quieter this time. "Nothing doesn't grow overnight," she said softly. "Nothing doesn't make your skin this pale." They held each other's gaze across the room, the fire crackling between them. Grace's hands were damp, her chest tight, but she didn't look away. She didn't know if he would listen, but she knew she couldn't pretend any more. What she didn't know was that within the next 24 hours, her instincts would be put to the ultimate test. Grace kept moving after the conversation by the fireplace, hands finding tasks almost on instinct, straightening the edge of a rug that didn't need straightening, repolishing the already gleaming brass knob on the armoire, aligning the row of medicine bottles on the tray the live-in nurse kept by the door. Routine was supposed to quiet the mind. Today it only gave her more time to think. She replayed Edward's face when she'd interrupted him. Not anger, and not the flash of pride she had braced for, but a kind of tired patience, the sort you might offer someone who didn't know the rules. "It's nothing." People with power use that sentence like a key. It opened every door out of trouble. What troubled Grace was that the stain on his robe had looked like trouble incarnate, gathering color the way clouds gather before a storm. Mid-morning light washed across the suite, widening and shifting as the sun climbed. Edward sat by the window as he preferred, a glass of water on the table, the day's papers unopened in a neat stack beside it. His right hand turned a page in the business section with practiced precision. His left hand, the one that had trembled as he reached for his tea the day before, rested against the robe's belt. Still. Too still, she thought. The stillness you choose because movement asks for too much. Grace carried in a fresh carafe of water and a cloth napkin, set them down without fuss, and let her eyes flick, just once, no more, to the brown robe where the collar crossed his chest. The faint bloom she'd seen yesterday had not vanished. It hadn't exploded either. It was simply there. A coin-sized whisper of maroon pressing through the fabric, as though the robe were attempting to speak for the wound beneath. "The ocean looks good today," Edward said, not turning his head. His voice had that old boardroom steadiness. "Yes, sir," she answered. The water flashed against the window glass, whitecaps scribbling bright lines across the March blue. A gull drifted lazily, riding a draft no one could see. He made a small motion with his hand, more a suggestion than a gesture. "Shut," and she understood. The windows needed to be cracked a fraction. She opened them, letting in salt air and a mild chill that combed through the curtains. When she turned back, he had folded the newspaper and placed it squarely on the side table, as if the act of finishing a page were a ritual he refused to surrender. "Would you like me to ring for Miss Green?" Grace asked. "For your morning vitals?" "Nurse Green knows my schedule," he said. "If I need her, I'll ask." Grace nodded and retreated to the adjoining sitting room, where a cart of cleaning supplies waited. She didn't touch the cart. She sat on the edge of a chair for a heartbeat, then rose again. The floor plan of the suite was muscle memory now. The long axis from bedroom to window. The shorter axis from fireplace to bath. The corner where the mahogany desk collected quiet dust because Edward rarely sat at it anymore. She moved along those paths, dusting frames, lifting and returning objects to their precise positions. Memory arrived, uninvited, with the smell of alcohol wipes and cabinet polish. A hospital corridor, years ago, so bright the light felt physical on her skin. She remembered standing with her mother outside recovery, waiting for a doctor to talk about her brother's surgery. He had come out in blue scrubs that hung a little loose, his voice calm and practical. "Watch for signs," he'd said, "not the dramatic ones, not a collapse or a scream. The subtle ones first, a color that isn't right, a fever that steals in, degree by degree, a patch of blood that darkens when it should be drying." "Bodies tell you the truth before people do," he'd said, and touched her brother's chart with the gentleness of a pianist laying down a chord. Grace left the sitting room and made her way to the service corridor. It smelled like lemon cleaner, coffee, and the faint iron trace of the old boiler at the end of the hall. Voices echoed lightly. Polite staff chatter that never rose above a respectable volume. In the pantry, Mr. Avery, the butler, was reviewing a checklist with the kitchen's morning crew. He looked up as she passed, his posture military straight despite the decades he'd served. "All well with Mr. Langford?" he asked, the way he asked everything. A question already expecting the answer he preferred. "Yes, Mr. Avery," she said. She heard her own voice and wished it didn't sound so neutral. "He's by the window." "As he should be," Avery said approvingly. "Sun is good for the spirits." Then, as if the house itself listened, he added, "And for appearances." Appearances. Grace thanked him and continued past Nurse Paula Green's small office. Through the glass, she could see the nurse in pale scrubs, typing into a tablet, her gray-blonde hair pulled into a bun that seemed to have been engineered for durability. Grace hovered. A pause anyone else would have mistaken for a step, and then tapped on the doorframe. "Morning," Paula said without looking up. "Give me 2 seconds." "Of course." Paula finished the line she was entering and glanced over. "What's up?" Grace chose her words. "Mr. Langford's robe. There's a spot near the incision. It looks darker today." Paula's eyes flicked down, then back up. "That happens sometimes," she said. "Diffusion through fabric can make it look worse. I changed his dressing last night." "I see. If he complains of pain beyond his normal, or if you notice feverishness, you tell me immediately. Is he complaining?" "No," Grace said. That was true. Edward did not complain. He edited. "Good, his labs are stable. We're past the high-risk window." Paula softened her tone, not unkindly. "You have good instincts, Grace. But remember, post-operative healing is messy. Not every smudge is an emergency." "I understand." On her way back, Grace passed the small linen closet where extra gauze and sterile pads were kept. She stopped, opened the door, and counted inward. Habit from a previous job. The stacks were neat. Sealed packages squared like playing cards. She closed the door and stood a moment with her hand still on the knob. A tray rattled down the service hall as one of the footmen rushed breakfast plates upstairs. Grace stepped aside. She could feel the house manager, Linda Bennett, before she saw her, a brisk current of perfume and purpose moving down the corridor. Linda's heels clicked an exact rhythm. "Grace," Linda said, hardly breaking stride. "After lunch, I'll need the East Gallery polished. We have a potential donor touring the collection on Thursday." "Yes, ma'am." "And please be mindful that Mr. Langford tires easily. Keep conversations minimal in his suite." "Yes, ma'am." Keep conversations minimal. Grace carried the instruction like a balancing tray back toward the double doors. In the suite, Edward had shifted a few inches closer to the open window, chasing a breeze like a man might chase a memory. She crossed to him with a light blanket, draped it without fuss, and felt, through the wool, the faintest tremor run along his shoulder to her fingertips. "Would you like more tea?" she asked. "Water," he said. "Cold?" She poured, watched his swallow, the tight motion of his throat, the brief pause he allowed himself when the glass touched the table again. Everything he did had an economy to it. A carefulness that looked like restraint until you realized it was necessity. Noon brought brightness and voices. A phone call from Edward's attorney that he took with a single word at a time. The steady pace of a gardener's steps on the gravel below. The far-off clatter as someone moved a ladder in the west wing. Grace kept her distance, present, but not intrusive, eyes briefly, periodically returning to the robe. The stain hadn't blossomed. It hadn't retreated either. It was a stubborn fact. She wrote a note in the small staff notebook she used for the suite, a thing no one had asked her to keep, but which made her feel that attention had a ledger. 12:35 p.m. Discoloration visible near sternal incision through robe, approx. Quarter size, maroon hue, no complaint of pain voiced, slight tremor in left hand after window adjustment. She paused with the pencil tip against the paper. The notes were for her, but she imagined someone else reading them and hearing in their clean lines the thrum of warning she felt. She closed the notebook and slid it into the sideboard where she kept the extra coasters. In the early afternoon, while Edward rested with his eyes shut, not fully asleep, she knew by the subtle way his jaw held itself, Grace took her break in the staff lounge. A small television murmured a daytime talk show. Two housekeepers discussed a cousin's wedding. Someone had left a bag of oranges on the table with a note, "Help yourself." Grace peeled one and ate it over a napkin, the citrus spray sharp and clean in the air. She thought of calling her mother, thought of saying, "Does it ever feel like you're the only one listening?" She didn't call. If she started that conversation, it would tug a thread she couldn't spare the hands to hold. When she returned to the suite, Paula was there, quick, professional, checking vitals with a cuff and a practiced hum. "Blood pressure is on the low side, but within range," the nurse said. "Let's keep fluid intake up." She retaped at a corner of a dressing under the robe. Grace looked away and patted Edward's hand. "You keep giving us something to do, don't you?" He smiled for her in a way he hadn't for anyone else that day. "I'm an investor," he said. "I stimulate the economy." Paula laughed. Grace found herself smiling too in the quiet relief of the moment. "It's all right," she told herself. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe diffusion through fabric did change the way things looked. She returned to polishing the fireplace tools, their black handles catching the light in tidy crescents. By late afternoon, the sun slanted in at a richer angle, turning the ocean beyond the lawns into hammered silver. Grace brought a fresh robe, identical to the one he wore, and set it on the chair near the bed. "If you like, I can help you change into this one later," she said, as neutral as an offer could be, "just to be more comfortable for the evening." Edward's gaze touched the robe, then lifted to her. He read more in her sentence than she had spoken. "After dinner," he said. Not dismissal. A timeline. Of course. Evening reassembled the house into its ceremonial self. Lamps flicked on, voices lowered. Doors latched with soft finality. Grace helped Edward move from the wheelchair to the edge of the bed with measured steps, each motion taught to her hands by repetition and care. He didn't push the robe issue then. The nurse would check the incision before night. Instead, she'd set his glass on the nightstand within easy reach, smoothed the sheet with the same attention she would give to speech, and switched off the brighter lamp, leaving the room in a pool of amber. Back in her small room, Grace sat on the bed with her journal on her lap, the house quiet as snowfall. She wrote down what she had seen, the color of it, the size. She wrote down what Paula had said. She wrote down the sentence the surgeon had given her years ago, "Bodies tell you the truth before people do," and underlined it once, lightly, so the page wouldn't crease. Sleep didn't come quickly. When it did, it was filled with images too mundane to be nightmares. A stain that refused to fade, a hand that shook and then went rigidly still, a door she meant to open and did not. She woke once to the sound of a gull outside and the blunted thud of waves against the sea wall, and lay in the dark, watching the faint square of window glow with coastal fog. At dawn, she rose, tied her hair back, and pressed her palms together for a moment the way she always did before the first tray of the day. A practical prayer, if there was such a thing. In the kitchen, the early crew moved with a shared silence, the coffee strong enough to make the air vibrate. She arranged fruit, toast, and a small omelet on the tray, checked the water carafe had enough ice, and stepped into the corridor, walking the path her feet knew. Service hall, left at the linen closet, past Nurse Green's office, down the short flight of stairs to the private door that led directly to Edward's suite. She paused with her hand on the knob and took a slow breath. The plan she'd half-formed in the night wasn't a plan at all, only an intention. Watch more closely. Gather a fact she could not be argued past, and then, if necessary, break rank. Not accusation, not panic. Action, clean and necessary as cutting a seam. She turned the knob and entered the suite. The curtains had been drawn just enough to let in pre-sunlight gray, the kind that makes furniture look unfamiliar and faces look honest. Edward was awake, the robe loosely belted, the newspaper unopened on the table. He lifted his eyes as she came in, and for a fraction she saw something in them. Not pain, not yet, but a weight that wasn't there yesterday. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he answered. She set down the tray, poured water, moved the chair a few inches so the light wouldn't hit his eyes directly. Only then did she look. Carefully, fully, the fabric at the collar lay flat. The color beneath it was darker than it had been, not dramatically, but undeniably. Grace felt the decision gather itself inside her, not a shout, but a steadying. The note in her ledger would change today, and if notes were not enough, she would make sure the house heard what the fabric had been trying to say. For now, she stood with her hands folded, watching the ocean turn from pewter to steel. The day cleared by degrees, and with it, her hesitation. The first discovery had been a whisper. Today, she would listen as if a life depended on it. Because she was beginning to believe one did. The morning passed in its careful routine. Grace moved in and out of the suite, checking on Edward without making it obvious she was checking on him. She changed the water in the vase by the fireplace, replaced the empty sugar jar with a fresh one from the pantry, and folded the newspaper sections after he finished them. Each time she glanced toward his chest, the robe told the same story. The stain was no longer something you could mistake for a shadow or a trick of the fabric. It was darker now, broader than yesterday, as though time itself had been feeding it. By late morning, she found herself standing by the window with a dust cloth in her hand, pretending to wipe down the frame. Edward had shifted in his wheelchair, adjusting the blanket on his lap. She caught the slight clench of his jaw, the kind of tension you use to hide discomfort. He reached for his tea, but his fingers curled against the handle for a beat too long before lifting it. Grace felt the pressure in her chest, that same mix of certainty and hesitation she'd carried for days. She had been raised to respect boundaries, especially in other people's homes, and this house had more unspoken rules than most. But there was a point where silence stopped being respect and started becoming neglect. She set the dustcloth aside, smoothed her skirt, and crossed to him. "Sir," she said gently, "I think we should have that wound checked today." He glanced up, one pale eyebrow lifting. "Grace?" "With respect," she said, cutting across his voice. "It's not the same as it was. It's bigger, darker." His gaze sharpened at the interruption, but she didn't flinch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the waves outside filled the space between them, steady and unhurried. "Do you know," Edward said finally, "I've had people working for me 40 years who never spoke to me that way." "I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear," Grace replied. "I'm here to make sure you're all right." A faint smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes, persistent. He murmured. Then, without warning, his breath caught. It was sharp and shallow, the kind that forces the body forward. His hand went to his chest, right where the stain spread beneath the robe. "Sir?" Grace's voice was no longer measured. She was already moving, dropping to one knee beside the chair. Edward's lips parted, but no words came, only a low, strained gasp. The armrest trembled under his grip. She reached for the robe's collar, pulling it aside. What she saw confirmed every fear she had been pushing down. The stitches were inflamed, the skin around them swollen, and from the seam a slow but steady bleed seeped through, dark and thick. "You're not fine," she said firmly. "Stay still." Edward tried to shift, but she placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. She grabbed the linen napkin from the breakfast tray and folded it quickly, pressing it against the wound with firm, even pressure. Warmth spread through the fabric almost immediately. Her eyes darted to the cordless phone on the side table. Still keeping one hand on the napkin, she reached for it, pressing the emergency button linked to the estate's medical line. "This is Grace in Mr. Langford's suite," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "He's bleeding from his surgical site and showing signs of distress. I need a doctor here now." The operator began to ask questions, but Grace cut her off. "No delays. Send them now." She dropped the phone back onto the table without waiting for a reply. Edward's breathing was uneven, his eyes half-lidded but still fixed on her face. "It's just—" he started, but she shook her head. "It's your life," she said, "and I'm not going to watch it slip away while everyone pretends it's nothing." The seconds dragged. She kept steady pressure on the wound, shifting the napkin when the blood soaked through too quickly. She could feel the heat of his skin, the fragility in the way his shoulders slumped. Yet beneath her palm, the rhythm of his heartbeat was still there, faint but holding on. She stayed locked in that position, watching the door. The sound of her own pulse seemed louder than anything else in the room. Then, finally, footsteps thundered down the hallway. The double doors burst open and Dr. Richard Myers strode in, the on-call physician, followed by a security guard carrying a black medical bag. The moment Myers saw the wound, his expression changed. "He's hemorrhaging," he muttered, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "We need to stabilize and get him to the hospital immediately." Grace stepped back just enough to give him room, but she didn't leave. She watched as the doctor took over, his hands moving with practiced precision. Moments later, 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. As they lifted Edward, his gaze found hers. The faintest trace of a smile appeared. "You were right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Grace managed a small nod, her throat tight. "We'll talk when you're back," she said. The paramedics wheeled him out, the sound of the stretcher's wheels fading down the hall. Grace stood in the doorway for a long moment after they were gone, the room around her feeling both too big and too quiet. But the silence was different now. Not heavy, but waiting. She closed the doors and let out a slow breath, knowing the day wasn't over yet. Grace didn't remember deciding to follow them, and her legs just moved. The corridor outside Edward's suite was a blur of polished floors and framed oil paintings as she trailed behind the stretcher. The paramedics moved quickly but not recklessly. Dr. Richard Myers close at their side, giving clipped instructions. "BP is dropping," one of the paramedics said. "We need to keep him upright." "Elevate slightly, but watch the strain on the stitches," Myers replied without looking up. Grace kept pace until they reached the front entrance, where the estate's towering double doors had already been thrown open. A black ambulance waited at the foot of the steps, lights flashing but siren off. In seconds, Edward was loaded inside, the doors shut, and the vehicle was moving down the long driveway toward the gates. She stood in the open doorway, the morning air sharp in her lungs. The house behind her was still, almost as if it was holding its breath. Then she turned, walked back inside, and was met with the steady, unreadable gaze of Mr. Avery, the butler. "Mr. Langford is being taken to St. Matthew's Hospital," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'll notify Mrs. Langford," Avery replied, though his expression carried no surprise. "And the board." Grace nodded and stepped aside as he moved toward the study. She knew there would be phone calls, official updates, maybe even a press statement, but none of that mattered to her now. What mattered was whether Edward would still be alive by the time those calls ended. The estate felt too big without him. Every hallway seemed longer, every room quieter. Grace went back to his suite, tidied the untouched breakfast tray, and replaced the soaked napkin on the side table with a fresh cloth. It was habit, but also something else, as if leaving the mess would feel like leaving a wound open. An hour passed, then 2. She busied herself with small tasks, but her mind kept returning to the image of Edward gripping his chest, the robe darkening as the blood spread. By early afternoon, the phone in the corner of the suite rang. Grace crossed the room in 3 quick steps and picked it up. "Miss Williams?" The voice was deep, precise. Dr. Myers. "Mr. Langford is stable. We stopped the bleeding. There was a partially ruptured artery near the surgical site. If it had gone much longer, he wouldn't have made it." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you for telling me." "He's asking for you," Myers added. "If you can come to St. Matthew's, they'll have your name at the front desk." She left the estate in a staff car driven by one of the security team, the trip into the city passing in a blur. The hospital was busy but controlled, the air filled with the soft beeps of monitors and the low hum of voices. When she reached the private recovery room, Edward was propped up in bed, looking pale but more present than she'd seen him in days. Myers stood at his side, chart in hand, but stepped back when she entered. Edward's gaze met hers instantly. "They told me you wouldn't leave my side until help came." His voice was weaker, but steady. "I just did what anyone should have done," she said quietly. "No," he replied, shaking his head slightly. "Everyone else ignored it. You saw me." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she simply stepped closer. The doctor excused himself, leaving them in the soft stillness of the room. "I owe you my life," Edward said, "and I don't say that lightly." Her instinct was to downplay it, but the weight in his tone stopped her. There was no performance here, no measured politeness, and only gratitude. Outside the window, the city moved on. Traffic lights changing, pedestrians crossing, unaware of the moment unfolding in this quiet hospital room. Inside, Edward Langford, a man used to controlling every variable in his world, had just faced the one thing he couldn't negotiate with: the fragility of his own life. Grace could see it in his eyes. The fear was still there, faint but real, and under it, something else, a decision forming. She didn't know yet what it would be, but she could feel its weight. For now, she just said, "Rest, sir, you're safe." And for the first time in days, she believed it. The following morning, Grace arrived at St. Matthew's earlier than she had planned. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee, nurses moving briskly between rooms. She carried a small bouquet of white lilies she had picked up on the way, unsure if Edward would even care for flowers, but it felt right. When she stepped into his private recovery room, the curtains were open, letting in the soft light of a cloudy morning. Edward sat propped up against crisp white pillows, dressed in a fresh hospital gown. His skin was still pale, but there was more color in his face than there had been the day before. On the tray beside his bed sat an untouched cup of tea and a neatly folded newspaper. He looked up as she entered, and a faint smile crossed his features. "Grace," he said, his voice steadier now, "I was wondering if you'd come." "I told you we'd talk when you were back," she replied, setting the flowers on the windowsill. Dr. Myers, who had been reviewing the chart at the foot of the bed, straightened. "Mr. Langford's surgery went well. The ruptured artery has been repaired. If Miss Williams hadn't acted as quickly as she did, he wouldn't be here now." He gave Grace a pointed look before leaving them alone. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the hum of the heart monitor. Edward reached toward the drawer in the bedside table, pulling it open with slow, deliberate movements. He withdrew an envelope and held it out to her. Grace stepped closer, curiosity flickering across her face as she took it. Inside were several folded documents and a short, handwritten letter. She skimmed the words, her eyes widening as their meaning sank in. "It's the deed to a house," Edward explained. "On the coast, with a view you won't believe until you stand there. Somewhere you can live without answering to anyone." Her throat tightened. I can't accept this." "You will," Edward interrupted gently. because I wouldn't be here without you. Because you saw me when no one else did, and because people like you deserve more than thanks. They deserve freedom." Grace felt heat gather behind her eyes. He was used to polite appreciation, to the kind of gratitude that faded as quickly as it was spoken. This was different. This was permanent. She closed the envelope carefully, holding it as though it might shatter if she gripped it too tightly. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice low. Edward leaned back against the pillows, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You've reminded me of something, Grace. That life is still worth living, and that it's not just about the deals you close or the wealth you hold. It's about the people who stand by you when it matters." She didn't trust herself to speak without her voice breaking, so she just nodded. When she left the hospital that day, the clouds were beginning to part, and a pale sunlight spilled across the city streets. Grace walked slowly, the envelope tucked safely in her bag, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She had come into the Langford estate as a quiet observer, someone meant to blend into the background. Now, she was leaving with the knowledge that she had changed a man's life, and, in a way, her own. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the world felt sharper, clearer. She knew she'd never forget the moment she decided not to stay silent, and the life it had saved. Some moments change lives forever. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe for more powerful tales, and share in the comments where you're watching from.